Back in November, ARCADE1UP had a sale on a number of cabinets directly from their site. One of the cabinets was the Outrun seated arcade machine, on sale for $450. I really wanted the stand-up version of this cabinet but could not locate one. I did not want to miss the opportunity to own this cabinet. I waited too long to purchase Star Wars, and now it is hard to locate that cabinet. So for $450, I figured I would get it and mod it into a stand-up unit. One of the things I knew I wanted to mod was the gear shifter. Among some other things, the gear shifter, as reviewers pointed out, was made of cheap plastic and felt cheaply made. Although it does the job just fine, some thought that the quality could have been a bit better, and I would agree with that assessment. After playing, the gear shifter does do the job, but does seem that it could break easily if one was too rough with it. The question was, could I find a replacement that I could swap out with the stock ARCADE1UP control? Back in December of 2020, I bought this gear stick from a store at AliExpress. At the time with the Microswitches, it was $27.99 plus $13.87 shipping. However, I have recently found some on sale for around $20 from different stores, which includes shipping. My plan was to use this particular gear shifter in a Pi mod, but did not get to that particular project. So my thought was, could I use this to replace the stock ARCADE1UP gear shifter? And the answer is yes. The gear shifter works great as a replacement. Now, I know what the first question is going to be from you, is that the ARCADE1UP stock gear shifter has a button that activates the turbo boost in Turbo Outrun. Since this gear shifter doesn't have a button on it, how are you going to use the turbo boost in Turbo Outrun? You're probably thinking that you'll probably have to drill another hole into your control panel. However, this isn't the case. On the Turbo Outrun game, you can change the button assignment for the turbo button and reassign it from the gear shifter to the start button. This allows you to still use the turbo boost in Turbo Outrun, and the only change to the control panel will be the gear shifter, since you'll be reassigning the turbo boost button to the start button. So in this video, I will explain some more details about the gear shifter, how to install, and some thoughts about the performance. It should be noted that I did this with the gear shifter I purchased back in December 2020, which is the one that was for $27.99 plus $13.87 shipping. I did recently purchase the one for $20, but have not received yet. When I do receive, I will put an update in the description to let you know if it operates the same way as the one I'm currently testing. So here are more details about the gear shifter that we're going to use to replace the stock ARCADE1UP gear shifter in Outrun. So this gear shifter includes 2 Microswitches, but you have to make sure that you select the option to purchase with Microswitches. Now, if you purchase from a different store, they may already have the Microswitches in there, so just check the options to make sure you do purchase with the Microswitches. Now, I found mounting this into the ARCADE1UP Outrun control panel was fairly simple. Once I took out the stock ARCADE1UP gear shifter, I simply put this in and I used 4 screws to hold it in place. I used number 1032 half-inch machine screws, but you can use any screws that you want to hold it in place. The gear shift lever itself is made of steel and PCB. It's very heavy and it's very robust. The body of the gear shifter is made of PCB, the shaft of the gear shifter is made of steel, and the handle is made of hard rubber in black color. Now once it's mounted, you'll notice that moving the gear shifter is very stiff. You're going to need to apply enough strength to shift the gears. The ARCADE1UP gear shifter, the stock one, it was very easy to shift from low to high. You just barely had to touch it to move it. This one, again, requires a little bit more strength. But it is a higher quality gear shifter for the price. And in my opinion, just feels better overall and doesn't feel like it's going to break off the cabinet. Now, I only mentioned the stiffness is because if you have kids that play the ARCADE1UP Outrun, it is possible smaller kids may have difficulty switching because it's going to require more strength. So you'll have to make that determination if this mod is worth it. At the end of this video, I will show you basically what I'm talking about as I compare the old gear shifter to the new one that you would install. So now I'm going to show you how to replace your stock ARCADE1UP gear shifter with the replacement. So of course the first thing you're going to have to do is remove the control panel. Now on my control panel, I already done this process, so I took out the replacement and put the old one back in so I could demonstrate how to do this. Now on your control panel, of course you'll have to take off the black cover, and I should mention that you will have to keep the black cover off because the height of the gear, the new gear shifter, is going to be too high to where that plastic black cover is not going to be able to cover that anymore. Also, if you never worked with this before, there'll be wire ties on all the wires. You'll have to get a razor blade or a utility knife to cut those ties so that we can access the wires and remove them properly. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to remove the top of the stock ARCADE1UP gear shifter. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip this over, and if we go to the right of this on the gear shift, you'll notice there are two screws there, two small little screws. So what we need to do is take our little screwdriver, and we're just going to remove those two screws. So once we get that second screw removed, you should be able to pull the top of the gear shifter off. So as you can see, it just pulls off and exposes the wire for the microswitch for the button that's in the gear shift. Now once you got that done, go ahead and flip the control panel back over, and what we're going to do is we're going to trace those two cables to the encoder board, and we're going to unplug that. Because we're using this gear shifter, it doesn't have a button in it, we no longer have to use that button anymore, so we can just leave that blank for now on. But once you unplug it, before you do, also check to make sure that there's no glue on these encoders and where they plug into the encoder board. Sometimes ARCADE1UP puts a lot of glue on these, so before you just pull it out, make sure there's no glue. And then once you have it unplugged, just pull it out and set that to the side. Now with that top part removed, we can remove the bottom part, and that's held together by 4 screws. So we're just going to use a Phillips head screwdriver and remove those 4 screws. And we're going to remove that final screw. And once we do that, and set that aside, and the gear shift control box will come out. And what we want to do is unplug those micro switches that are on the gearbox from the encoder board. So there's going to be 2 of them. So if we flip this over and we view the encoder board from the top, we're going to unplug the 2 cables for the micro switches. So the top one is for low gear, the bottom one is high gear. So I'll remind you about this once we reconnect the new one up, but just so you know that the 2 that we just unplugged, the top one is low gear, the bottom one is high gear. So once we get that unplugged, we're going to reassemble the stock ARCADE1UP gear shifter, and we're just going to do this so we just make sure everything's all together in case we want to replace it back to stock. Because in some cases, if you want to resell this, or you just don't want that gear shifter anymore, you can always swap it back out and replace it back to stock. So just put the top back in, thread the cables for the micro switch, and just put the 2 screws back in. And once that's done, we can set that aside and we can move on to installing the new gear shifter. Okay, so I set aside the control panel to concentrate on the new gear shifter. Now it's a little dusty because, again, I've already put this in the ARCADE1UP Outrun. I just took it out just to show you how to put it in. So you have to screw in the 2 micro switches on your own. So usually this will come with the gear shifter and then 2 loose micro switches. You just have to place them correctly. If you look how I have it placed, where the roller is on where the gear switch little plastic piece is connecting with it, so that you move it, it actually activates the micro switch. You'll also notice that the micro switch has to be completely flush with the side of the gearbox. Otherwise, it's not going to activate the micro switch. Now you can install the micro switches at any time. I prefer to do it now before you put it in the cabinet, because once you put it on the control panel, because once you do that, it's going to be harder to screw down the micro switches. So once you get the micro switches on in place, there's going to be 4 screws that you're going to unscrew to get to the gear shaft. So we're just going to remove those 4 screws. And once we remove them, then the plate will just come off, and then you should see the interior of the gearbox. Now, when you got the micro switch in place, one of the prongs on the micro switch will impede the screw. Just pinch that prong to get it out of the way so you can unscrew the screw. It's not going to hurt anything, and you can bend it back in place once you're done getting everything set up and installed. So once we get the screws unscrewed, just pull on that plate and it'll pop off. You may have to give it a little bit of pressure to get it off. So there it is. So here's the interior of it. So now the next thing, this is going to be the hardest part to do, and that is we have to remove the E-ring that holds the shaft in place. Now getting this E-ring removed is going to be the most difficult part of this. So what we need to do, what I usually do, is I push down on the top of the gear shaft, and as you can see here where the arrow is pointing, that's where the E-clip is. I apologize, I've been referring to it as an E-ring, but it's actually referred to as an E-clip. But in any regards, that E-clip holds the shaft in place, so we need to remove that in order to remove the shaft so that we can put this in the ARCADE1UP Outrun control panel. Now I'm going to stress right now, be very careful when you're taking this out. Now when you take this out, what I usually do is I push on the top of the gear shaft, which will then make it a little bit easier to get that E-clip out. And what I do is I take a small little precision flathead screwdriver and I try to put it in between the E-clip and kind of put pressure on it to try to get it out of there. And then what I do is once I get it a little bit in there, I then get a bigger screwdriver so I can apply more pressure on it to fully get it out. And then if I need to, I'll use some needle nose pliers to pull the E-clip out. Now again, I'm going to stress this, be very careful when you do this. This E-clip is in there very tightly. So if you're going to have to apply a lot of pressure to get it out. Now it's going to be a little easier for me because I've already done this once. So it's not going to take me as long, but it took me about 10 or 15 minutes to get this E-clip out. But because you have to apply a lot of pressure on it, the screwdriver may slip. And if you're doing it towards yourself, you may, quite frankly, you may impale yourself or cut yourself. So again, I cannot stress enough when you're doing this, be very, very careful. Because again, the E-clip is in there very tightly. Even because I did this before, it took me about 5 minutes to get this thing out. And also, just make sure that when you're trying to get this out, make sure that it doesn't like fly off the shaft, because if it flies off the shaft and you lose that E-clip, then you're not going to be able to get the shaft back in. So again, as you can see, what I'm doing, I'm struggling to get this off. So, and I've done this before, and it's actually a little easier to get off, but again, it's on there very tightly. Just be patient with it. Try not to rush it. Try not to get frustrated. It's going to take a minute, or it's going to take a few minutes for you to get it off. And again, I just don't want anyone hurting themselves, so just be very careful taking that E-clip off the shaft of the gear shifter. So at this point, I got it out enough to where I could get some needle nose pliers to pull out that clip. And again, it gets in there pretty tight, but once you get it out, that's what it looks like. And once you get it out, what you're going to do is you're going to set that E-clip aside, and then we're going to be able to take the gear shaft out of the gearbox. So once again, I keep stressing to be careful, but the reason I do that is because I almost cut myself doing this. But the best way to do it is when you take a small screwdriver, once you make a little opening in it, then take a bigger screwdriver to pull on it so that you can loosen it enough to where you can get some needle nose pliers to completely pull it out. So once you get that out, we're going to set that aside, don't lose it. And now with that out, you can pull out the shaft. Now there's also a little, another little thing here that goes into the bottom, and that's spring loaded, so it won't stay in there. It'll just pop out again until you actually put it back into the gearbox. And also note that there's a lot of lubricant in there, so your fingers will get lubricant on it. So you may want to have some paper towels on hand to wipe your hands off to get that lubricant off. So now that we got the gearbox out, now we can put this onto the control panel. So we're going to grab our control panel again, set it up, and now we need to line it up so that we can screw it down to the control panel. Now again, as you can see, I've already done this, so I already have the screws holes already pre-drilled. But what you'll do is you line this up on the back, and then what you're going to do is you'll have to line it up like you would a joystick. So once you get it on there, you'll flip it over, and what you want to do is line up that center hole right there, so it's lined up between the left and right, where the gear is, where those middle lines are. You want the circle there, the hole there, to line up on those, centered on those two lines to the left and the right. So once you get it lined up, then you can drill your holes and screw it down. Now when I did it, mine's a little lower than what it should be, but again, once you get it lined up, just adjust it, and then once you determine where you want to do it, I would clamp it down and then drill your holes and then put in your screws. Since I've already pre-drilled the holes already, I've already done this, so I'm just going to line it up and I'm going to put the screws back in. So again, I'm using number 10-32 half-inch machine screws. So I'm just lining it up. Again, you would have it clamped down or something, or you'd have it traced out, then trace out your holes and then take a power drill to drill the holes and then put the screws in. I've already done that, so I'm just putting the screws back in, and these screws will hold it in place. Now once you've got your holes drilled, before you screw it down, you may want to use some hot glue to put on the bottom of this to further secure it, because it takes a lot of strength to shift. You don't want this thing popping out. Now I didn't use hot glue. The screws I used to put this in place seemed to hold okay, and I didn't have to use hot glue, but you may want to use some hot glue to hold it in place to give you extra stability. Okay, once we get all the screws in place and double check to make sure they're pretty much tight, we've got it securely on the bottom. So we can just flip it over and we can take a look. And again, mine wasn't lined up perfectly, but that's okay, because as long as it shifts up and down, that's all that matters. I would have liked to have it centered, but I screwed up, and I didn't measure it properly. But again, it's okay, it still shifts, so it'll be fine. So once that's in place, now we can put the shaft back in. So you can try to put the shaft, you can try to put the little rod in there, but I don't think it's going to work. I didn't have any luck doing it, putting it in there. So you may have to get some needle nose pliers to get that rod back in place. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to put the gear shaft back in to the hole, and then we're going to put the E-clip back on to hold the gear shaft in place. So we're just going to do it this way. So get it all lined up. we're going to put it in the top, and I apologize for the camera work here. I was trying to get a good angle here so you can see what I'm doing. But as you can see, I'm trying to put that rod back in there, and it's not quite working out the way I thought it would. So in the moment here, I'm going to get some needle nose pliers to put the rod into that shaft so that it stays in there. Okay, so now that I got that rod in there, and what you do now, you're going to push on the top of the shaft so it exposes the little gap so you can put the E-clip back in. As you can see, I have the E-clip and I'm pushing on it. You just want to try to make sure you get in there a little bit, and then once you get it in there, you may want to take some needle nose pliers to apply pressure on it so it goes over the gap. In this case, I flipped it back around onto the top because the angle I had it wasn't really working out. So I'm just applying pressure onto the control panel to push down on the gear shaft so it exposes the little gap where the clip goes in. And once I did that, I was able to push it in. And that secures the shaft so it won't fall out. Okay, so once the E-clip is back in place, we can put the plate back onto the gearbox. So we're just going to put that on there, and then we're going to replace the 4 screws once it's in place, and just make sure everything's lined up properly. And then we'll just grab our 4 screws, and we're going to go ahead and screw that down. And one of the screws, you'll have one of the prongs from the micro switch impeding it. Just bend it back a little bit so you can screw it in, and then once it's screwed in, you can bend it back. And once you have that plate in there, that's it. It's installed. As you can see, we're moving it up and down. And now we can go ahead and create the wires for the micro switches so that we can connect it to the encoder board. Okay, so now we're going to assemble the wires that we're going to use to connect to the micro switches and to connect to the encoder. Now, if you really want to, you can reuse the cables that were in the stock ARCADE1UP. But one, I don't like to reuse the cables because in case I want to put everything back to stock. And two, the connectors are too small to connect to our micro switches anyway. So we're going to have to create new cables anyway. So what I do is I like to have the cables pre-crimped as I shown here, and we're going to use some wire joints as well to connect the cables, because the cables as they aren't going to be long enough, and then I have some wire strippers as well. So what I do is we're going to need 2 ends with these 2 white ends on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the connectors that are used to connect to the micro switches. I'm going to cut those 2 ends off, and then I'm going to do it on the other one as well. And all the cables and whatnot that I use in this video, it'll be in the description where you can purchase them if you want to. But again, you can make your own cables as well. This is just the way I do it. So on each end, we're going to strip a small amount of the wire casing off it to expose the wire. And we're going to do that for that one, and we will go ahead and do it for the other one as well. So very easily just strip it off. There you go. And do it for the final one as well here. There we go. Now for the other 2 here, we want to clip off the white connector because we want the ends that connect to the micro switches. So we're just going to clip off those 2 white ends off there. And once we clip those off, we'll then strip the ends of those cables as well. Okay, so once we strip the last cable, now we're going to connect these cables together. So that's where these wire joints come in place. So this will allow us to connect 2 wires together. Now, normally what I did in the past, I would just twist the cables together, put some black tape on it, or in some cases, some people get the heat shrinks. But I find these wire joints to be very easy to use and to connect wires very easily. So what you want to do is you want to twist the ends, and then on one end there's a little clip there. You press it in and you slip in one end of the cable and let go of the clip, and it holds it in place. And we're going to do the same thing with this end as well. Just slip it in there, and you notice the other end has that white end that plugs into the encoder. So for the other ends, we're going to use the connectors that plug into the microswitches. So again, on the other side, we're going to line it up per color, and we're going to press on that, slip in the end, and do the same thing for the white cable. And I'm probably going to have to twist this a little bit here. And once you do, just again press on the end of the wire joint, slip it in, and there you go. You have a longer cable without having to do any putting on the black tape or anything of that nature. So we did this for the one cable, and we're going to go ahead and do it for the next cable. Okay, once we get the last one in there, we have our two cables ready to connect to the microswitches on the new gear shifter, so we can plug it into the encoder. So I'm going to set everything aside here, and we're going to get the control panel. Okay, we're going to flip it upside down. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is just determine which microswitch is which by moving the gear shifter up and down, just to determine which one's up, which one's down, or which one's low, which one's high. So once we do that, then we can cable up the microswitches to the encoder. So we're going to take one of our cables, and what we're going to do is I'm going to first plug in one of the ends here. So there's three prongs on this micro switch. We're only using the two. We're using the top one and the next one down. So it doesn't matter how you put the wires on here. It's not going to matter. But what I do is on the top one, I put the white cable, and then I put the blue cable on the next one down. Again, if your wires are different colors, you'll have different color schemes, but that's fine. So I'm checking to see if this is the low or if this is the high. And once I make that determination, I plug it in. So this one is the high, so I plugged it into the bottom port on the encoder, and the next one's going to be the low one. So again, I'm just going to plug this in into the other microcontroller. I'm sorry, micro switch, I should say. And again, just keeping everything uniform. I'm going to plug in. Well, looks like I plugged in the blue into the top one. I didn't keep it uniform, but again, it doesn't matter. It can be in any order you want. It's just in an on-off state. So again, this is the low, so it's going to plug into the top of the encoder, or the top port where those two go. And of course, we're not going to plug in the button for the turbo switch because we're not using it anymore. We're going to set that up to be the start button once that's done. But once we have those micro switches connected up, that's it. We're ready to put this in and back into the Outrun cabinet and test it to make sure everything works. Okay, so I got my control panel back in. I temporarily have it. I don't have it fully screwed down just in case I have to take it out. But we're going to test to make sure everything powers on and comes up. But we're also going to test the gear shifter to make sure we plugged it up properly. So when this comes up, the first thing we should be able to do is hit down, and it should go to the gear on the screen. And it does, as you can see. So everything looks good. Everything is plugged up. Now we need to redirect the turbo boost button to the start button. And so we're going to do that we're going to go to Turbo Outrun, and we're going to go into settings. And once we go into settings, you're going to see an option here that says turbo uses. Right now it's start to the start button, but yours is probably going to say turbo shifter. Well, if it says turbo shifter, we want to change it to start button. So this will change the start button for the turbo boost in Turbo Outrun. And again, this is the only game that uses that button. So all the other buttons will function in the games. So now that we've changed that setting, we'll go ahead and test it just to make sure it works. So we're going to go into the game Turbo Outrun, and we're going to test the turbo button, and we're going to test the shifter. So we're going to do that here in a moment. So we're going to start the game. And if I'm holding the shifter a little awkwardly, it's only because I have to stand back so I can film, and normally I wouldn't be this far away from the screen. So we're going to select manual, and now we're going to go. So everything's working. So if we go shift it into high gear, there it goes, it's shifted. Now we just have to wait for the turbo button to come up. And as you can see, the turbo button works when we press the start button. So we're good. Everything's looking good with Turbo Outrun. Everything seems to be running fine. So let's go ahead and try one more game. We'll go into Outrun here. Start the game. Make sure the shifter works in Outrun as well. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't, but we'll just test to make sure. So here we go. You see the little shifter there. It looks like it's working. So we're in low gear right now. I should shift in high gear here in a moment. And there we go. So this looks like everything's working properly and it's good to go. So finally, as I said before, I'm going to show you how much pressure you have to put on this and what it sounds like when you put the new gear shifter in here. Now here's the old ARCADE1UP. As you can see, you don't have to put a whole lot of pressure for it to go back and forth, and the microswitches are pretty silent. But you see, if I put that same pressure on there on the new gear shift, it's not going anywhere. And as you can see, when I push up, I have to use a little bit of strength, and you can hear it switching back and forth. So because you have to put so much strength into it, this may not be a mod that you may want to do if you have kids playing this. Now, I'm not saying that you need superhuman strength to move this up and down. I'm just saying that it's stiff enough to where if you have kids playing it, they may not want to, it may be a bit too much for them. But for me, I don't think it is, but some people may believe that. So again, it's up to you if you want to do this mod this way. Now, me personally, I like the way it shifts. I like the heaviness of it, the stiffness of it. It just feels like it's better quality, and when I shift, I know I'm shifting. It's not like a light touch, it's like a heavy touch, and I like that better than the ARCADE1UP stock. So that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. For those people who think that the stock ARCADE1UP gear shifter is flimsy and cheaply made, this is a replacement that may be for you. You can purchase these gear shifters on AliExpress. The one I purchased with shipping was like about $45 when I purchased it a year ago. However, there are stores that sell it for $20. I can't speak to those ones that cost $20, but I did buy one, and once I get one and I can test it, I can tell you if it's about the same or if it's any different or if it's any worse than the one I put in here. The only difficulty that you're really going to have on this when you're putting in the new gear shifter is getting that E-clip out. It's on there very tightly, and you just have to be extremely careful when trying to remove it because you're going to have to put a lot of pressure on it to get that out of there. But once you get that E-clip out, it's a little easier to get it back in, and once it's in there, you're good to go. And as far as the turbo boost button in Turbo Outrun, we don't have to worry about that because in the game settings you can go in and change and remap the turbo boost button to the start button, so you can just use the start button in game to do the turbo boost. And since that's the only game that uses that button, there's no you don't have to alter the control panel to add an extra button or anything. You're just swapping out the gear shifter. So that's about it. Again, if this is hopefully this is a project, if you decide to do it, it was helpful. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.